Hello and welcome to Bitstocks TV. It's 2019 now, and yes, we're going to be kicking off the season with a whole host of content. We're going to be starting that with David A. from Bitstocks, our CTO, and also Steve Shadders, Technical Director from nChain, and they're going to be running through exactly what's been happening with the BitcoinSV project thus far. One thing I must say first is that I would like you to do your own due diligence before getting involved in any investment, and this is not to be seen as an investment advice. Also, we would like to look through iTunes, Spotify, all the usual channels that you guys can find us through to get involved in the content that Bitstocks are producing. So let's kick off.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. We have yet another Bitstocks podcast today with a very, very special guest, Steve Shadders.
Hi.
Steve Shadders is a technical director at BitcoinSV project at nChain. So could you let us know a little bit about yourself to present for those who don't know? How did you end up in Bitcoin? How did you join nChain and what you are currently doing? And then we will drive the discussion from there.
Sure. Okay, so I started off in the Bitcoin world in 2011. And I was a total noob at that point. I actually went back a couple of months ago and found my very first post on Bitcoin Talk, in which I was asking, why do we have a 10-minute block time? Why can't we shorten it to 1 minute? So everybody learns from their mistakes eventually. And I got involved because at the time, mining pools had just sort of started to become a phenomenon, and there was very little software around that could handle the volume of traffic that mining pools have to deal with. So
was that the time about CPU mining, GPU mining, or ASICs?
It was around the time of the transition. Yeah, well, it was just after GPU mining had become a thing. So everyone was using this piece of software called Push-Pull-D, which was written by Jeff Garzik, and no offense at all meant to Jeff. He knocked it up quickly because there was a need for it, but it didn't anticipate certain problems that the Bitcoin client had at the time. For example, it could only feed a certain amount of work out to miners. So I built a version of a mining pool engine that could feed off multiple Bitcoin daemons, and then that project just kind of snowballed and got bigger and bigger. And at one point, I think it was running close to 50% of the network.
That's impressive.
Yeah, so I left the Bitcoin world for a few years and got dragged back into it by a colleague of mine who thought it would be a good idea for me to run a mining pool, because after 2 years of mining pool engine development, I'd never actually run a miner or a pool myself. And that was when I met Craig early the year before now. And started getting involved with nChain doing mining pool related stuff, and again that just kind of snowballed until here I find myself living in London and heading up the engineering department of nChain.
Okay, so you have pretty good understanding of Bitcoin, the protocol, the software implementations, and how come you started working on BitcoinSV specifically? Was that because, as we know, that there was like two different implementations, Bitcoin Cash and BitcoinSV. Both of them are striving to get like bigger blocks, but they have different ways of achieving bigger blocks. And BitcoinSV is striving to do on-chain scaling quite aggressively. So right now, we at Bitstocks are very, very, very supportive of BitcoinSV, because we understand the technicalities behind it, and we understand the positiveness that it can bring from straightaway scaling for the businesses to join and to use the Bitcoin protocol. So tell us a little bit about the BitcoinSV in particular. Like what is the roadmap, which is for the next year? What are you planning to do to solve the technical problems that we can encounter during the roadmap? Basically everything that you want to achieve with BitcoinSV at nChain. What's the goal? What's the ultimate goal?
BitcoinSV project has sort of been described as having four pillars, the four S's, which neatly matches up with Shamir's secret sharing scheme. That's really irrelevant. It's just a cute little coincidence. So they're scaling, security, secure zero confirmations, or secure instant transactions. I'm really trying to get away from the term zero conf, and stability. Stability refers to keeping the protocol stable, and that stability aspect really helps us out because we're not wasting any time or energy like we were for the vast majority of last year, having discussions and arguing about protocol changes. So that means we can really put our focus into scaling. The security side of it, I've talked about fairly extensively before. That's really about making sure we've got really solid QA processes in place so that mistakes don't. Mistakes will happen, but mistakes happen rarely, and when they do, we can catch them before they cause problems. But the scaling work is probably part of the reason why the BitcoinSV project came into existence. We were somewhat frustrated with the pace of work that was going on in that sort of specific area. And there's a lot of things that we can do internally with SV, which we've got to do very, very carefully because we've got to make sure we don't make consensus-breaking changes.
Consensus rules, yes.
But there are also other approaches which we're having a lot of success with, which currently are only being used on the testnets, the Gigablock testnet, which is taking a lot of the work away from BitcoinD. So BitcoinD is a nightmare of a violation of the principle of separation of concerns. It does a whole lot of things, and it really doesn't need to do all of those things. The important part of Bitcoin is making sure that the consensus rules are respected and not broken accidentally. But there's a whole bunch of other stuff. The whole peer-to-peer networking code is not really part of the consensus protocol. That doesn't necessarily need to sit inside, a single process. So one of the things that we've been working on as a proof of concept for the Terranode project is actually building an external agent that pairs with a Bitcoin node and handles all of the peer-to-peer work on its behalf. BitcoinD handles single connections really, really quite well. It handles lots and lots of connections really, really quite badly. So if this external agent can sit there and handle the multi-threaded parts of peer-to-peer networking and then just feed transactions in and out of the Bitcoin node on a single connection, then the collective machine that you've got there with these two kind of components becomes an awful lot more performant. So that's one of our focuses. We're also doing the work internally on BitcoinD as well, but that's kind of a slower path to success. So we're doing all of these things in parallel, and it's also an interesting proof of concept for the notion of the Terranode, which is the idea of breaking up BitcoinD into multiple microservices. We need to start doing that at an early point, because when you start separating the components of Bitcoin SV out, that's where you start to understand and see the dependencies in between them.
The interaction between different components.
How they can be broken, whether they even can
I tend
be
to
broken.
agree. I think if someone was to have a look into the evolution of BitcoinD, how it came to be, it is right now a little bit confusing what it provides out of box. It can be a wallet, it can be a miner, it can be just yourself just to provide blockchain data for other people to synchronize to yourself. It literally does a lot of things, and in some of those aspects it doesn't quite perform well. So if we were to decouple all these components into a single agent, as you said, or entities or software, which does quite well and they're designed to do that task, I think we will have quite drastic improvements when it comes to using the Bitcoin protocol overall. So one of the examples that I would actually mention is actually two things which comes in my mind. One is the GUI, the GUI. It's not, I think, BitcoinD's responsibility to provide GUI out of the box. There are SPV wallets, there's proper mechanism to safeguard your wallets outside of Bitcoin network offline, and you can use them to interact with the Bitcoin network with passphrases and everything. So I think that code on its own should be completely wiped out and never brought back. Another thing which BitcoinD is lacking, I think, is proper APIs to interact with the network. the database and the blockchain is growing exponentially, and going forward it will be even more so. So we need quite stable APIs which can handle the load which we are expecting in the upcoming years, and we need quite easy access to those data, like for developers to interact right now with the Bitcoin network and to find out how much funds or balances you have in given addresses or transactions. It's a constant hop between different APIs, and it is frustrating because first of all you lose that scalability, and second it's constantly changing as well. In the upcoming versions of Bitcoin Core, they're removing some APIs, they're rebranding them, and it's not stable, as you mentioned. So stability is very important key for API developers and developers in general to build software on top of Bitcoin network. In terms of security, you did mention that you were quite stingy about it. So what were the measures that you have taken to provide that type of scrutiny or level of scrutiny?
Well, there's a few different things. So, I mean, we've got a formalized change management process internally in the BitcoinSV team. So there's a certain set of steps that any piece of code has to go through before it reaches production. We've actually got a QA. The BitcoinSV project is sort of structured as a development branch of the project and a QA branch, and they're actually independent of each other. So any change basically has to get signed off by both halves. And the QA team's almost as big as the development team. So code basically goes through an iterative cycle initially as the developer works on it and gets code review from his peers in the dev team. And some external people as well. And then it feeds into this QA process, which is about 5 different test environments it has to go through and 5 different sets of tests. Every new set of tests becomes a regression test. So everything, every piece of functionality that has ever been tested in the past gets retested. And then it feeds into our public test nets, which is something on my to-do list for this year is to go out and get the business community engaged in those test nets, and make sure every exchange and every wallet, whatever, has a test instance of their software running on those test nets. And then code needs to get put out for public review, which brings me to probably the second key pillar of our security strategy, which we have a bug bounty program. It's one of the biggest in the world. It rivals Google's and Microsoft's of the world. So that encourages external security researchers to come in and look at the code and see if they can break it, because there's a hefty reward if they succeed. And the third pillar is a security audit process that we've been through. So we engaged with a professional security audit firm who've done a complete audit. It took about 6 weeks. It's probably not exhaustive. There's more that they could do, and we're planning on engaging them for further work. But that really helped in a couple of ways. First, it identified a few issues that we needed to resolve, both in code and in process, and it also provided us additional testing tools, etc. So they helped us with instrumenting a fuzzing tool, which basically takes a piece of code and throws random data at it, and checks to make sure it's giving the expected output. So security in that sense is it's never absolute, but it's a process of continuous improvement. Yeah. So we actually did recently, we had a bug get through our process. It wasn't a serious bug, but it was one that got through. And as a consequence of that, in the spirit of continuous improvement, we're going to be looking at how that actually got through. What would have had to have been different in the code review process to have ensured that it got caught in the code review stage or in one of the subsequent testing stages. So we'll do that, and as a result, that means that
constant improvement
that same sort of type of bug is more than likely going to get caught next time instead of slipping through the net. So yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. We talked a lot about the software in itself. what would you say there are 3 major limitations right now as it stands in the Bitcoin software to be able to scale?
Well, all of the limitations really come back to one, which is CS main lock. It's a single global lock that almost every part of the code takes out. So it essentially makes Bitcoin single-threaded. And I talked earlier before about how Bitcoin performs really, really well with a single connection. That's because it's basically dedicating one thread to that connection, and it doesn't have contention from lots and lots of different peers trying to get a hold of this lock. Because of that, it makes it really hard to parallelize a lot of the code. So this has all been quite well known since Gigablock testnet was launched in 2017. The accept to memory pool, which is the part where a transaction comes in and Bitcoin now needs to check all of its check that it meets all of the consensus rules, etc., before admitting it to the memory pool, which is the pool of transactions that it'll choose to mine from. So that's a huge bottleneck, and we can get around that a few ways. One is by parallelizing the code internally. The other is by feeding the transactions in sequentially and doing as much work as we can. So one tricky thing that we are working on right now, and we're doing it very carefully because, well, you'll see why in a second. Is one of the biggest overheads of transaction validation is checking the signatures. It's a really CPU intensive job. So what you do when you check a signature is you take the transaction and you transform it into this what's called a sig hash, and that's actually what you feed into the signature verification process. So we can do that externally. If you're talking about a trusted source, then the external agent could actually calculate this sig hash, verify the signature,
then notify you whenever the job is
and then
done.
when it sends the transaction into the node, it sends it with this sig hash and a flag saying I've verified this sig hash. So the node checks that the sig hash matches, but it doesn't actually have to do the signature verification. The other big one is UTXO lookups. UTXO is the database of unspent outputs, and every transaction has to be checked to make sure that all of its inputs are there and actually exist. So over Christmas, I was experimenting with a Redis-backed UTXO implementation. Redis is an in-memory key value store, which is lightning fast. We're able to build a complete UTXO by downloading.
What is the current size of the UTXO in terms of gigabytes?
In Redis, it's about 15 to 20 gigabytes because Redis has a lot of overhead.
So technically speaking, like,
but on disk,
32 megabytes RAM, you can host your UTXO set in memory in a decent hardware, and you can blazingly fast access it. Yeah. I think in level DB, it's a lot more compact. It's like somewhere between 2 and 4 gigabytes, but that's the other slow part of validating transactions. So it has to go through a lot of testing first. I mean, basically, I've got to go through the entire history of the UTXO block by block and verify that it's got exactly the same results as what's in the Bitcoin D level DB implementation. But it's actually not too hard to sort of swap them out and plug them, swap one around for another. So, that's kind of my goal is with Bitcoin is to stuff as much stuff into memory as possible, because memory is not that expensive these days. Not at all.
I've got a 64 gig machine at home that I do a lot of my development work on, and it's sitting there holding a full UTXO set for mainnet and Gigablock testnet and the public testnet.
That's on your local machine. And if you were to talk about like dedicated servers or like decent machines out there where you can just use for business, I think generally speaking 64 gigabytes is standard. That's kind of what you should expect from a decent machine. 64, 128, 256 sometimes gigabytes is standard when it comes to when you have like extensive database machine
Google Cloud, I think have a machine. It's I can't remember the exact number, but it's well over a terabyte of RAM. So RAM's not going to be a big limitation for us. And even if it was, we can attack that with sharding. So people probably have nightmares if they think about the idea of having a UTXO database on a different machine, and you've got to make a network hop to get over there. But if you're talking about insanely large numbers of transactions, and you shard your UTXO into 16 shards or whatnot, it's not the time that it takes to get a single UTXO. That will always end up being longer. But if you can batch this and say, okay, I want to fetch 1 million UTXOs at once, by spreading it across lots of different machines, you'll still have the latency of the network hop, but you'll get your results back 16 times faster. Or be able to get 16 times more results in the same time frame, same period of time. Yeah.
Okay, so software-wise, I do join the concerns that you have in terms of separation of the code, making them proper agents responsible for what they are doing properly and doing it well. What do you think about the language, as in C++, that was chosen to write BitcoinD? And right now we have maybe better languages suited for this type of tasks, such as Rust or Go. Do you have any concerns about the language limitations itself when it comes to building concurrent code or parallelization or multi-threaded applications? Do you think we will reach that stage where the language itself will become
C++'s primary advantage is that it's really, really damn fast, but it can be tricky to code in. It's actually not my first language at all. I'm not the greatest C++ coder
what are you good at?
I cut my teeth on Java, and it's still my go-to. I'm trying to move over to Kotlin, which is basically a nicer version of Java. It runs in the JVM, but that'll take me a bit more time. No, there's no reason why BitcoinD needs to be C++, except for the fact of the difficulty of migrating code or rewriting code and ensuring consensus compatibility. So we're probably stuck with it for a while. And my suspicion is that once you start to break up Bitcoin into microservices that have a neat
Each
API wrapped around them,
different language,
there's no reason why you need to be locked into one language. Some bits might be better off written in JavaScript. Touch wood, that never happens. But certain parts of Bitcoin lend themselves naturally to different types of languages. Rust is one that I kind of like. One of our solutions architects describes it as almost impossible to compile, but once it does, you're pretty sure it's doing what you planned for it to do. That sounds like a really good language approach or language philosophy, I suppose, for consensus code. But my suspicion is that the actual consensus code that checks the transaction validation rules and the block validation rules probably will be all that will end up being left of BitcoinD, the original code. It'll be the last to get rewritten. Because it's fairly solid. It's been around and it's been worked on for quite a long time, and that's the part that's most dangerous to change, and it's also the part that's probably the least important to change in the near future.
It's not the direct bottleneck.
No.
Okay. If we jump from software to the hardware, because a lot of people, when they submit code online for PR and everything on a Bitcoin core, they tend to over-optimize, I would say. They always take in consideration to write more detailed code, which should be running in a less capable machine. So what would you say Bitcoin code is in conjunction with the hardware that we have right now? Are we using the full potential of the hardware which is available, or we are my personal gut feeling is that we are massively underusing what is available?
Yeah, I agree. We are. We're not using CPU cores to to their limit at all. We're not using memory to its limit. There actually is an in-memory cache for the level DB, which is what keeps the UTXO at the moment. It still wouldn't be as fast as Redis if it was all cached, but I think by default that's configured to use about 400 megabytes, which is only a small fraction of the UTXO. And if you've got a server sitting there with 32 gigabytes even, or even 16, you can fit the whole UTXO into that cache. Disk space is another thing that we kind of consider as a premium. Yeah, you're right. Bitcoin Core, they tend to take the approach, let's minimize resource usage. We're actually looking at ways to maximize it. I had to have a bit of a stop and I think a few weeks ago, because I was talking to one of our architects who was considering the problem of massive blocks, terabyte blocks in the UTXO, and how we can actually get like reasonable performance out of it. And he had this idea that at first I thought, God, you're crazy. He said, let's keep a copy of the UTXO for every block. And I went, what? That's like, at the moment it's 4 gigabytes. So you're going to add 4 gigabytes. And what about when it's terabytes? You're going to add, a few terabytes of data for every single block. And he said, yeah, well, let's actually like think this out and work on the basis of unbounded storage and see what problems we can solve. And it turns out you can solve quite a few of them by doing it that way. And it does take a little bit for you to get your head around the idea of we're just going to use unlimited amounts of storage.
I think it is a developer mentality because it comes from whenever somebody teaches you programming or just in general in schools, people tend to say like, be cautious about how much memory you're using, be cautious how much resources you're consuming. And that's kind of is ingrained when you start building bigger applications. You tend to not use everything which is available at you, because you think your software will be running in conjunction with other software on the same machine. However, if you have a dedicated hardware, as you said, which is dedicated just for that given task, why not use full capacity, full potential of the hardware? And that's what I think Bitcoin software should be doing in any places, storing the UTXOs or establishing network connections more than 8. This type of settings, the default settings which have been set in Bitcoin Core, are very, very, very minimal, and they are not up to date with the hardware that we have nowadays, I think, personally.
Yeah, well, we've got to change our approaches. Instead of, we don't want to be wasteful of resources unnecessarily, but we need to actually ask ourselves the question, how can I use more resources to make this job more efficient, make it happen faster? Yeah, there's lots of ways that we can do that. Put stuff in memory, put it in memory multiple times in different data structures so that you can look it up more efficiently under different scenarios. I think the whole, even outside of Bitcoin, the whole kind of scaled software industry is starting to get their heads around this. You've got the rise of the NoSQL databases,
big data,
where they threw out the idea of normalized data. Like, only ever store one piece of data once. It's actually much more efficient and much faster if you store, whole documents and store multiple copies of them. Redis itself works on this principle. The most performant way to get persistence to disk is to use the append-only log. So if you've got a key and you add it and then you delete it and then you add it and then you delete it again, you've got 4 entries in this append-only log, whereas you could just have one. But it's by far the fastest way to do this. You're just dumping stuff out to disk. You're not searching for anything to override it or anything like that. So yeah, it's a mindset that I think is slowly changing in the engineering world in general, not just in Bitcoin.
For good.
But the Bitcoin world is probably a bit further behind. And like I said, I had to have a reality check when the architect suggested this, let's keep a copy of the UTXO for every single block, because I read, oh my God, that's crazy. And I just stop and think, oh, I thought you said you were a big block at Shadders. Well,
he cornered you.
But here you are panicking about disk space. So I went, okay, well, let's change the attitude and chew it up.
I think I had some of these reality checks as well when I discovered how cheap the SSD drives and how big they have become. It was exclusively like for big servers previously when they came out initially, and it was very expensive. Nowadays you can buy 500 gigabytes SSD for less than £100.
Yeah. I just
insane.
I just put a 2 terabyte one in my machine at home over Christmas actually, because we're doing this stuff with Redis and I needed a big one, a big fast one.
Network is another thing which grew quite fast. If my memory is correct, previously the most expensive thing when you were hiring like a dedicated server was the inbound and outbound bandwidth.
Yeah.
And it was very expensive to get your own dedicated 100 megabytes line. It was, wow, you definitely are running some sort of like Amazon or something behind the scenes. So are you sure you need this? But nowadays it's kind of like, oh, you have 1 gigabyte down, 500 up, included, unlimited, unmetered. Like that's huge performance when it comes to like 5-10 years ago.
Yeah.
And people still think like, we can't be downloading 250 gigabytes to start with and join the network or have the whole blockchain. One, it really depends if you do need those 250 gigabytes. Why do you need them? You can always have services where people can query the data, find about the transactions, or just literally broadcast your transaction from offline to online if you want to move things around, right? Second, 250 gigabytes or even 500 gigabytes, 1 terabyte is nothing. It just goes so fast. People have in-home connections for 100 megabytes.
Yeah, I mean,
for 40 quid. Or
my home machine, I can download the blockchain in about 4 or 5 hours. Download and validate the whole thing. So, I mean, it's not really a big problem for if you look at the future of Bitcoin and the way that the network is most likely going to be structured, the people running full nodes are going to be running them out of data centers. So they're going to have high bandwidth connections by default anyway. Probably the miners will want to have dedicated connections between the miners
to propagate the blocks faster
to the other miners, because from their point of view, it's economically beneficial for them to have faster links with miners than everyone else. So it doesn't matter if someone in a store buying a coffee has a bit of extra latency, or they're
not at all.
Their 500 byte transaction takes
seconds, maximum
50
seconds.
milliseconds instead of.
We're literally talking seconds maximum.
Yeah.
From the whole interaction, joining the network, confirming, and then receiving a confirmation for the merchant or something like that. Yeah. So on that front, like, what would you say is the main audience for BitcoinSV node implementation, and who is the main audience?
When we started the BitcoinSV project, we did have a bit of a think about this. We said, okay, so who are our customers? And the answer was fairly obvious. Well, the first answer was fairly obvious because the project was commissioned by miners. They asked us to do it, so obviously they were our primary customers. There are more people that use Bitcoin nodes, full Bitcoin nodes, now than probably need to, simply because there aren't alternatives that provide the services that they need. So I mean, most exchanges, most merchants or payment processors, etc., probably run full Bitcoin nodes. Most block explorers do. But if you actually look at what they don't need all of the services that BitcoinD provides. It's just that there aren't external separate tools that can do that. A UTXO database is probably a fairly useful thing for a lot of businesses to have if they want to validate their own transactions. A payment processor, for example, when they receive one, they want to check that the transaction is actually valid without having to go to a BitcoinD. If you've got an external UTXO database and a set of validation, the validation code itself, of which there's quite a few implementations. It's probably a situation where even if the code is a bit buggy and you get 1 in a million, that's not quite right. It's not the end of the world, because you'll send it off to a miner and you'll find out pretty quickly that it's not going to be mined or not accepted. So yeah, those are tools that the ecosystem kind of really needs, and in 2019 that'll be part of our focus, which will be engaging with all of the people that are providing APIs like this, all the people that are consuming them, finding out what they actually need them for, and trying to work out if there are better tools or SDKs that can be provided.
So what can we expect this year from nChain?
Well, a lot of work on the BitcoinSV project, obviously, which will be focused on the scaling side. On the secure instant transactions side, there's some work that needs to be done in BitcoinSV to support some of the things that we want to do. But one of the key things is going to be a merchant API. And what form that will take, whether it's a REST API or a JSON RPC or a binary protocol, that hasn't been settled yet. But that API is really quite important because it enables merchants to basically get all of the assurance that they need about
the zero confirmation. It's secure enough for them to.
They can find out in advance what transaction fee is required, and I mean once you've got to that point, once you've got to the point where you say you know exactly what transaction fee is required by 99.9% of the miners. You can get a fairly high level of assurance before you've even broadcast the transaction. But if you can broadcast a transaction to miners and then get a response from them a second later to say that they've accepted the transaction, then the zero conf problem largely goes away. So yeah, the other thing I think you can expect to see will be more news on the Terranode project. It's kind of a two-phase project. There's a proof of concept which is sort of aiming at a smaller target, and then there's the full Terranode design, which we're still working on at the moment. We've learned a hell of a lot from running the BitcoinSV project, which feeds into the Terranode project. So. It's quite a synergy for one organization to be doing these two things at the same time. What else? Oh yeah, on the security side, we are working on a protocol specification. So we've got a draft of that, and the reason for that is because documenting all of the Bitcoin consensus rules is something that's never actually been done. It's always been said that the protocol spec is what the code does, including all the bugs, which is actually kind of true in a system that relies on consensus compatibility. The bugs are part of the consensus rules. So once we've documented that, then that feeds into a set of tests, which will give us a degree of assurance that we've actually got the entire consensus protocol covered by test cases. And that then means that people can start rewriting validation engines because they've actually got something realistic to test against. So those two processes were actually kicked off as a result of the Terranode project, which started early last year and delayed for various reasons, mainly because we were too busy having arguments about the consensus protocol. Which makes it really hard to write a spec for it when it keeps changing. But we made some substantial progress on those late last year. So when that test suite is complete, then that'll be a public resource that anyone will be able to use for any implementation project.
So I think was it a week ago we mined a block on BitcoinSV which was bigger than 100 megs. Was it like a week ago or something like that?
Mempool mine.
Mempool was the miner mine. So what do you think we should expect in the next 6 to 12 months?
I think our focus will be on sustainable mining
without orphaning
large
and
blocks,
having any issues with the propagation, I guess.
Yeah. The primary bottlenecks are the transaction propagation, the speed with which they're spreading out over the network, and that's primarily because the nodes are limited in how many they can take in before they start to broadcast them out across the network. Hence the reason why I'm building this peer-to-peer agent that sits as a companion to the node. And there's other bottlenecks as well. There's transaction propagation, block propagation, which again can be addressed by a separate peer-to-peer agent. And the third one, which is one we came across just recently in our Gigablock testing, was the mining API itself. So we've implemented a new mining API. And in fact, I should give credit where credit's due. The initial implementation was in Bitcoin Unlimited. We've tweaked it a little bit, but it eliminates one of the biggest bottlenecks to scaling, because in the old way of doing it, you had to send an RPC call to the Bitcoin node.
There was a limitation of how many entries you could have entered in a mempool for the mining, was it?
No. It's just the response it sent back basically included all of the transactions in the block template that you're planning on mining. And there's actually no need for those at all. The miner doesn't need them. So that means if you're trying to mine 128 meg block,
you need to make as many as
it's got to send back not just 128 meg, because it's converted into text. It's actually double the size, plus a bit more because there's extra junk in there. So you end up with about close to 300 meg. And the RPC stack kind of has some issues with that. So it takes quite a long time.
The whole JSON RPC implementation in Bitcoin in general is very slow.
Yeah,
I think you have 4 threads which work quite maximum 4 threads which allow you to communicate with BitcoinD. And as you said,
well, by default, all our standard configurations bump the number of threads up to quite a lot higher than that. It can actually perform reasonably well. So I mean, in some of the tests I was doing over Christmas, we were able to submit transactions depending on what else was going on at a rate of between 6,000 and I think about 18,000 per second through RPC. That was with batching. Batching the trend.
Just an RPC batching.
So sending 100 at a time. That was just on a single thread. So it actually is capable of performing quite fast. And 1,000 transactions per second equates to about 128 meg block. So 18,000 equates to, do the maths off the top of my head, it's a couple of gigabytes. So you can squeeze the performance out of it, but ultimately with this mining API, it was about reducing this 300 megabyte response down to less than a kilobyte. That's actually all that's needed, and it doesn't matter how big the block is. The response can stay the same size. So that's a big bottleneck for us to get past.
Okay. So obviously there's a lot of development happening in BitcoinSV. Really cool projects from what you describe. Very interesting. Very interested to know them a little bit more about those. How we can go about following the development of those projects, because so far the communication channels, from what we can see on GitHub, for instance, they are kind of stalled. There hasn't been a lot of updates. Yeah. What would you tell us, what will be the communication channels to go through in order to be up to date with everything which is happening?
We've got to get better at that. I accept that. Although there's been a couple of reasons for that, partly because we had the lead up to November 15, which was obviously a pretty busy time for us, and then the CoinGeek conference, and then Christmas, New Year. We had an exhausted team that had been working insane amounts of overtime for quite a while, so pretty much told them to go off and have a bit of a rest. But yeah, we're all back on deck now, so it is time to improve that. Now, I know there are some communication channels which I haven't been participating in a whole lot on various Slacks and Telegrams that have emerged, but in fact it's on my to-do list for this week to reach out to sort of I guess the people I would consider some of the more major developers in the space, and get them, and have a conversation with them about where's the sort of the best place for these communications to take place. But they've also got to take place at multiple levels. So there's there's a developer layer, and they need to all be talking to each other so that we can align what we're doing. There's also the business layer, and we have a business services unit in nChain which will be working busily on this, and the BCom Association also has a business development unit. So we need to be talking to businesses and find out what it is they actually need out of, what services do they require? What do they need out of BitcoinSV? What do they need out of, the way we should approach this is get them to just say, these are the services that we need. This is what our business needs to consume. And then we can work out as engineers what's the best way to deliver that. And it most likely won't be in Bitcoin D. As we sort of mentioned before, it's doing too many things. And if you do too many things, you end up doing them badly instead of doing one thing really well. So there are different layers, I guess, of communications that we need to be involved in as engineers in the Bitcoin space. Obviously, there's even more of that as you sort of climb up the layers to business level discussions, which I'll be involved in to some degree, but less and less as you get toward the business layer. So we'll be working on that. And thank you for the reminder because it was on my to-do list for this week. But
You're welcome. I think it is important also to note that online communication and online presence comes with its drawbacks. As a developer, you want to stay focused. You definitely want to stay focused and away from the noise. So some people would consider that if you don't participate in online discussions, you're up to something, or you have your own private groups of discussion, hence you are censoring the discussion. But I think there should be a good balance between who is contributing to the discussion. As you said, if you're interested on using Bitcoin as a business or as an individual and you want to tell us what you're using and what you need it to be doing for you, you can participate to the discussion. But right now, it is very, very easy to manipulate the online narrative. So I think we tend to, me personally as a developer, when I say we, the developers tend to stay away from that noise. I don't think it should be perceived as, the developers are trying to do something behind the scenes. So I think people should understand that it is time consuming to basically waste time and try to win online battles where you can spend that time more wisely and actually contribute to the ecosystem in itself. But at the same time, I do understand like the other side of the table where people do want to have updates. People want to follow up the project. People want to know what's happening, what's upcoming. And I think that's the fine balance which the developers need to establish, the groups need to establish and communicate those activities online. So for what will be the medium then? Would it be like maybe private forums or list groups or Twitter, Reddit? Would you say it will be just like closed kind of chat groups or?
No, I don't think closed, but I think you can strike a balance there without being closed and without someone deciding who gets to be in and out.
I think closed is a strong word too.
Yeah. I mean, Not a group that's sort of invitation only, but a group that's just basically unannounced, so people have to go looking for it. That tends to work quite well. So anyone can come along and join. If they have the interest in the topic, then they'll sort of seek it out and find it. And you've got to strike a balance between these communication channels. The signal to noise ratio. It's got to be high enough signal that the people who have the most to contribute will actually maintain an interest and stay involved in it. And as a developer, you walk a fine line. Development, I mean, as you probably know, can be quite an antisocial activity. You've got to get yourself into a certain zone. You've got to build up a big picture of all of this machinery in your mind so that you can think through how it's all got to go together. And an interruption is massively disruptive because it's not a case of just going, okay, I'll do this now and then I'm back to this. You've got to kind of rebuild all of that stuff in your head all over again. And I personally find that after a week or two of development, I forget how to speak to humans and have a conversation. So it's important. You've got to strike a balance, and I find the best way for me to do that is just to have set days. Today's not a development day. It's a come into the office and deal with all of the stuff that I have to deal with there, and come and actually have a conversation with some humans here. But I think one thing I've observed over the years in not just in the Bitcoin space is that a communication channel tends to have a life cycle. It'll start off with a few people. It'll build up to a point where it's got a very high signal to noise ratio and a very highly skilled set of participants, and then it becomes attractive to other people who just want to see what's going on and be fly on the wall. But a few of them also want to get involved, and then the noise begins. And eventually the kind of key participants, I suppose, get annoyed that there's too much noise, so they start talking somewhere else, and that just gradually evolves into the next channel. And I've seen that cycle repeat over and over again. So I don't want to get married to any particular place to say this is where the conversations happen, because I know that it's only for a limited life time anyway.
Okay. Just before we wrap it up, I have one final question for you. Where do you see Bitcoin going in the next 5 years?
Well, the next 5 years, I think the next year is going to be really exciting, but the next 5 certainly will. I mean, our goal is a global payment network, actually more like a global notary service. There's 3 primary areas I can see transaction volume coming from. The first and the obvious one is payments, day-to-day payments. The second is tokens, and I'm excited to see what the tokenized team start to work on this year now that they've released the platform. And the third one is, like I say, notary services. So this thing called MetaNet that Craig announced at the CoinGeek conference late last year. It's quite an abstract idea and a concept, but once you start overlay a concrete implementation on top of that, it becomes a lot easier to get your head around why this is actually something of value. So Craig's talked before about EDI, electronic data interchange, at a very, very brief description. A business like Walmart or whatever places an order, there's an electronic document purchase order that goes to the supplier, and that then gets married up with a delivery note, which then gets married up with an invoice, which gets married up with a payment receipt. And all of these documents are in a kind of a standardized format, which has been around for decades. And there's a whole ton of advantages to doing that on the blockchain.
Would you say we'll have any hope to see maybe governments trying to give some more sides to their expenses or what they are doing to the people via blockchain?
To give some more
side?
Well, I guess you can do all of this stuff on the blockchain without it being visible to anybody. So you can use like shared keys and things like that, so that you can put stuff onto the blockchain, encrypt it, you can give someone access to it later. So it's not necessarily about visibility of this sort of thing. There are other benefits for governments. I mean, what government is going to say no to a transaction that pays the VAT straight to the treasury? That's a nice little efficiency gain.
Would you think we'll still have their current fiat money, which it gets converted in order to settle your VAT or corporation tax or whatever you want to settle? But do you think we'll have any hope, as I said, for the government to start adopting like their monetary system to be on top of blockchain? Would we see any country, maybe like some small countries, adventurous countries?
I think it'll start with small adventurous countries, but there's steps in that direction already. I mean, there are some states in the US that have, and certainly some small European countries that are willing to accept taxes paid in crypto. So that's a first step, is governments actually accepting crypto as a form of payment. But I think the first step will be for some small countries to tokenize their own currency. I don't think governments are quite comfortable with the fact, with the idea of not controlling monetary policy just yet.
The supply is still going to remain under their control.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the evolution of it is going to be people will start using Bitcoin for, tokenized fiat and other tokenized assets. And in time, they'll start to work out that it's actually better. Bitcoin itself is a better currency. And the users will probably drive that. They'll go, I'm not going to use this tokenized pound anymore. I'm going to pay straight
Hopefully
from Bitcoin.
bring to a unified currency, which will be Bitcoin.
Yeah. And that kind of transaction volume, that can come from these tokenized fiat currencies, along with other sources, is what will start to create the stability in the price of Bitcoin, because the volatility is simply a function of lack of use that we see, and the volatility we know is one of the biggest barriers to adoption. So if we can eliminate the volatility by driving volume in another way with tokenized fiat currencies, then the volatility drops, and all of a sudden Bitcoin itself becomes a much more stable option, a better option for
transacting
for end users to use. Yeah. So there's a lot of value in tokenizing fiat currencies, I think, not least of which is it onboards people. You need a little bit of Bitcoin to trade your.
Well, we have seen this
currencies.
like even within this small ecosystem, which is the exchanges, who they started rolling out their own stable coins per se, because it's much easier for them to manage their fiat money behind the scenes. So just hold it one place and then send them everywhere that they want to. Reflect that with anybody's account, but they have single place to hold the money and never it moves. It's just virtual, it's digital. So they completely, even though fiat money 97% is digital, it's never cash. But a step further is actually tokenizing them and making them available via internet.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Stephen. It was great pleasure talking to you. Do you have any final questions or anything that you would like to say?
Not that I can think of.
Okay.
I guess just that I'm really quite excited about 2019 because the way that 2018 ended was eventful to say the least. But the fact that we have an ecosystem full of businesses that are actually driven by solid business plans that are all aligned on the question of consensus rule stability really means that there's no more wasted work. There are so many things that we need to do that we've been distracted from doing for quite a long time. And just in the last month or so, or the last 2 months since November 15, the amount of stuff that's been happening internally at nChain has blown my mind. And I've also seen other developers out there in the space doing fantastic work and progressing at a phenomenal pace. So I'm really excited to see where we're going to be in 6 months and in 12 months time. And I think that we've turned a corner for Bitcoin, so I'm happy.
Very good to hear that. Thank you again, Simon.
Thank you.